How did a handful of farming villages, scattered along a muddy river in a land of millet and dust, become the longest continuous civilization in human history? How did a people who shaped clay with their bare hands 7,000 years before Christ go on to invent paper, gunpowder, the compass, and movable type, reshaping the destiny of every nation on earth? And why, when every other ancient empire crumbled into silence, did this one refuse to die? I am standing where it all began. The yellow river stretches before me, its waters thick with the same golden silt that once nourished the first crops ever planted on this plain. The air carries the scent of wet earth, and the light falls in long amber shafts across fields that have been tilled for 9,000 years without interruption. Somewhere beneath this soil lie the foundations of Banpo, where Neolithic families fired painted pottery and carved jade into symbols of power. This is the cradle. This is where the story opens. And what a story it is. This is not a fragment. This is not an overview. What lies ahead is the complete history of ancient China, told from its earliest origins to its final imperial breath. A journey spanning nearly 9 millennia of human achievement. You will walk with the first kings of the Xia as they forge bronze and claim divine authority. You will stand in the oracle bone workshops of the Shang, where priests carved questions into turtle shells and held conversations with ancestors. You will witness the Zhou dynasty proclaim the mandate of heaven, a concept so powerful it governed Chinese politics for 3,000 years. You will follow Confucius as he wandered between warring courts, teaching virtue to rulers who preferred the sword. You will watch Qin Shi Huang crush 6 kingdoms into one empire, standardize the written word, and command an army of terracotta soldiers to guard him in death. You will travel the Silk Road with Han merchants carrying bolts of silk westward toward Rome. You will enter the cosmopolitan streets of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, the largest city on earth, where Persian traders, Buddhist monks, and Chinese poets shared wine under lantern light. You will see song engineers mix saltpeter and sulfur into the world's first gunpowder. You will stand on the walls of Hangzhou as Mongol cavalry thunder across the southern plains. You will sail with Zheng, his treasure fleets into the Indian Ocean, and you will walk the vermilion corridors of the Forbidden City as the Ming Dynasty reaches for perfection in porcelain and architecture. And finally, you will witness the slow unraveling of the Qing, the last dynasty, as opium and foreign warships shatter an empire that believed itself eternal. This is a civilization that invented bureaucracy, meritocratic examination, silk weaving, cast iron, seismographs, and printing. A civilization whose philosophers ask questions about duty, harmony, and the nature of power that still shape how billions of people live today. Every chapter of this journey reveals not just what happened, but how ordinary people lived, what they believed, what they built with their hands, and what they dreamed. If you enjoy these complete journeys through ancient civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a lost world, told with the depth and beauty it deserves. Now, let us begin our journey at the river's edge, where the first seeds fell into dark soil, and a civilization unlike any other took its first breath. Long before any king claimed heaven's favor, long before bronze was poured into sacred vessels or characters were carved into bone, there was only the river, the Yellow River, swollen with loess sediment from the high plateaus of the west, carved its way across the North China Plain, depositing rich silt in wide floodplains that would become the cradle of a civilization. Around 7,000 years before the Common Era, Small communities of hunter-gatherers began to linger near these fertile banks, discovering that certain wild grasses could be encouraged to grow, harvested, and stored against the lean months of winter. Millet was the first gift of this landscape. Hardy and drought-resistant, foxtail millet thrived in the semi-arid climate of the Middle Yellow River Valley. Farther south, along the Yangtze and its tributaries, wild rice paddies took root in waterlogged lowlands. These two grain systems, developing in parallel across thousands of kilometers, would define the agricultural foundation of an entire continent. The transition from foraging to farming unfolded not in a single generation, but across centuries of gradual experimentation, as communities learned to select seeds, clear land, and manage water. At Banpo, near modern Xi'an, a settlement of the Yangshao culture flourished around 5,000 years before the Common Era. Semi-subterranean houses with timber frames and thatched roofs clustered around a central plaza. Storage pits held surplus grain. Kilns fired painted pottery decorated with fish, geometric spirals, and abstract faces rendered in black and red pigment on buff clay. The people of Banpo buried their dead in communal cemeteries at the village edge, sometimes placing ceramic vessels beside the body, suggesting belief in an afterlife that required sustenance. The Yangshao culture stretched across the Wei River Valley and beyond, its painted pottery tradition enduring for nearly 2,000 years. Villages grew larger. Defensive ditches appeared around settlements, hinting at competition for resources or territory. Pig and dog domestication supplemented grain cultivation. Silk production may have begun in this era, with evidence of silkworm cocoons found at early sites. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, a transformation swept across the eastern plains. The Longshan culture emerged, distinguished by its stunning black pottery, thin-walled and burnished to a metallic sheen on fast-spinning wheels. Longshan settlements were larger, more stratified, and often enclosed by rammed earth walls requiring organized labor on a scale that implied emerging leadership hierarchies. At Taosi in modern Shaanxi province, a walled town of nearly 300 hectares contained elite burials rich with grave goods alongside commoner graves with almost nothing. Social stratification had arrived. Jade working reached extraordinary refinement in the Liangzhu culture along the lower Yangtze Delta. Artisans shaped nephrite into ritual objects of breathtaking precision, bai discs symbolizing heaven, Kong tubes representing earth, and elaborate plaques carved with mask-like faces bearing circular eyes and feathered headdresses. These objects required hundreds of hours of patient grinding with abrasive sand, for jade cannot be chipped or flaked. Their presence in elite burials across vast distances reveals networks of exchange and shared ritual meaning, connecting communities separated by rivers and mountain ranges. These Neolithic worlds were not isolated experiments. They traded obsidian, shells, and finished goods across ecological zones. They developed astronomical observation, aligning structures with solstices. They created symbols scratched into pottery that some scholars consider proto-writing. They built the social architecture of hierarchy, ritual, and surplus management that would make complex states possible. The river continued its ancient work, flooding and receding, depositing and eroding. Along its banks, granaries filled and populations grew, walls rose higher, jade grew more precious, and somewhere in the accumulating complexity of these late Neolithic communities, in their walled towns and stratified burials and ritual objects of astonishing beauty, the first stirrings of kingship began to take shape, waiting for the Bronze Age to give them form. The walled towns grew larger, the jade-adorned burials grew richer, and then, sometime around 2070 before the Common Era, according to later Chinese historical tradition, a figure named Yu tamed the great floods and founded a dynasty, the Xia. For centuries, scholars debated whether this dynasty existed at all, or lived only in the myths recorded by later historians. Then, in 1959, archaeologists began excavating a site near the modern village of Erlitou in Henan province, and what they found changed everything. Erlitou sits in the Yiluo River basin, a tributary system feeding the Yellow River. The settlement dates to roughly 1900 to 1500 before the Common Era, placing it squarely within the traditional time frame of the Xia dynasty. What emerges from the earth here is not a village. It is a planned urban center, sprawling across 300 hectares at its peak, housing perhaps 20,000 people. Its layout reveals deliberate organization, palatial compounds at the center, workshops radiating outward, residential quarters beyond. This is a capital. The palace foundations at Erlitou represent the earliest monumental architecture yet discovered in China. Rammed earth platforms rise above the surrounding terrain, supporting timber-framed halls arranged along north-south axes. The largest compound covers nearly 10,000 square meters, enclosed by corridors and walls that channel movement, that control access, that physically manifest the distance between ruler and ruled. Architecture becomes ideology. Space becomes power. But the most transformative discovery at Erlitou is bronze. Here, for the first time in the Central Plains, artisans mastered the piece mold casting technique that would define Chinese bronze work for a millennium. Unlike the lost wax method used elsewhere in the ancient world, Chinese founders carved intricate designs into clay molds, assembled them around a core, and poured molten metal into the gaps. The resulting vessels possess a sharpness of detail, a precision of form that astonishes. Ritual wine vessels called zhui stand on 3 delicate legs, their lips flaring into points. These are not utilitarian objects. They are instruments of sacred authority. The bronze workshops at Erlitou required extraordinary coordination. Miners extracted copper and tin from distant mountain sources, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. Smelters processed raw ore. Mold makers carved designs of increasing complexity. Founders controlled temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. This chain of production demanded centralized command over labor, resources, and specialized knowledge. Bronze became both symbol and substance of royal power, too costly and complex for any but the ruling elite to commission. Turquoise inlays appear on bronze plaques shaped like dragons or abstract masks. Jade working continues from Neolithic traditions, but takes new forms, including blade-shaped implements too thin for practical use, crafted solely as markers of status. Cowrie shells from distant southern coasts appear in elite burials, evidence of long-distance exchange networks controlled or taxed by the center. The political structure emerging at Erlitou suggests a territorial state projecting influence across the Central Plains. Smaller sites in the surrounding region share Erlitou-style pottery and bronze forms, indicating either direct control or powerful cultural dominance. This is not yet the bureaucratic empire of later centuries, but it represents a decisive threshold, the concentration of military force, ritual authority, and economic surplus under a single ruling lineage. Whether Erlitou is the Xia capital remains debated. No inscriptions have been found to confirm the dynasty's name, but the archaeological reality is undeniable. By the early second millennium before the Common Era, a complex state existed in the heartland of what would become Chinese civilization. It commanded bronze production, monumental construction, and regional networks. It housed a ruling class whose authority rested on ritual performance and control of sacred materials. Around 1500 before the Common Era, Erlito's influence waned. A new power was rising to the east, centered at Zhengzhou and later at Anyang. The Shang Dynasty was gathering strength, and its scribes would eventually record the first written characters in Chinese history. But the foundations had already been laid at Erlitou, in rammed earth and molten bronze, in the architecture of kingship and the rituals of power. The age of dynasties had begun. The new power announced itself with fire. Sometime around 1600 before the Common Era, a dynasty rose in the Central Plains that would rule for over 5 centuries, leaving behind not merely ruins, but the earliest readable words in Chinese history. The Shang Dynasty transformed kingship from a matter of bronze and rammed earth into something far more ambitious, a direct conversation with the divine. The earliest Shang capital at Zhengzhou already surpassed Erlitou in scale. Its rammed earth walls stretched nearly 7 kilometers in circumference, enclosing workshops for bronze casting, bone carving, and pottery production. But the Shang were restless builders. Their kings relocated capitals multiple times before settling, around 1300 before the Common Era, at a site near modern Anyang in northern Henan province. Here, at a place called Yinshu, the ruins of Yin, the Shang created their most enduring monument, not a wall or a palace, but a written language. Oracle bone divination defined Shang spiritual life. Royal diviners inscribed questions onto the shoulder blades of oxen or the flat undershells of turtles. They applied intense heat until the bone cracked, then interpreted the patterns as answers from ancestral spirits and natural deities. The questions ranged from matters of war and harvest to the health of royal consorts and the meaning of dreams. After divination, scribes carved the questions and sometimes the outcomes into the bone itself. Over 150,000 fragments have been recovered from Yinshu alone, preserving a script of roughly 4,000 distinct characters, the direct ancestor of modern Chinese writing. This script reveals a civilization of remarkable sophistication. The Shang king stood at the apex of a cosmological hierarchy, mediating between the living world and a realm of powerful ancestors. The supreme deity, known as Dai or Shangdi, controlled weather, warfare, and fortune. Below this high god existed a pantheon of nature spirits and royal ancestors arranged in strict genealogical order. The king alone possessed the authority to communicate with these forces, making divination not merely religious practice but the very foundation of political legitimacy. Bronze casting reached extraordinary heights under Shang artisans. The piece mold technique, developed from Erlitou traditions, achieved a complexity unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. Massive ritual vessels, ding tripods, gui food containers, jue wine cups, were cast with intricate surface decoration featuring Tayoti masks, dragons, and geometric thunder patterns. The largest surviving vessel, the Simuwu rectangular ding, weighs over 800 kilograms and required the coordinated labor of hundreds of workers. These bronzes were not decorative luxuries. They were sacred instruments through which offerings of food and wine reached ancestral spirits, binding the living dynasty to its divine predecessors. The royal tombs at Yinshu expose the darker dimensions of Shang power. Great cruciform pits descend 10 meters into the earth, their ramps lined with sacrificed humans, servants, prisoners of war, sometimes hundreds in a single burial. Chariots with horses and drivers were interred whole. Bronze weapons, jade ornaments, and carved ivory accompanied the dead king into the afterlife. This was a society where the boundary between life and death remained permeable, where the dead required service and sustenance, and where royal authority extended beyond the grave. Beyond the capital, the Shang controlled a network of subordinate territories through a combination of kinship ties, military force, and ritual obligation. Regional lords received bronze vessels from the king, marking their incorporation into the sacred hierarchy. Warfare was frequent, conducted with bronze-tipped spears, halberds, and compound bows from horse-drawn chariots. Campaigns against surrounded peoples, the Qiang to the west, various groups to the south and east, provided both territorial security and sacrificial captives. Yet, for all its power, the Shang world remained bounded. Its direct control extended perhaps 300 kilometers from Anyang. Beyond lay peoples who traded with the Shang, adopted elements of its culture, or resisted its expansion entirely. Among these peripheral powers, one grew steadily stronger in the Wei River Valley to the west. The Zhou people absorbed Shang bronze technology and administrative methods while nurturing their own ambitions. By the 11th century before the Common Era, the Shang Dynasty had grown brittle, its last king remembered in later tradition as a tyrant lost to cruelty and excess. Around 1046 before the Common Era, Zhou armies swept eastward and the Shang fell. But the oracle bones lay buried in the earth at Yinshu, waiting 3,000 years to speak again. The Zhou conquerors faced a problem no army alone could solve. They had toppled a dynasty that claimed divine favor through ancestral spirits and oracle bone divination. Now they needed to explain why heaven had permitted such a revolution, and why their own rule deserved obedience. The answer they crafted would echo through 3,000 years of Chinese political thought. They called it the Mandate of Heaven. Unlike the Shang, who believed their royal ancestors held permanent communion with the supreme deity, the Zhou proposed something radical. Heaven's favor was conditional. A ruler governed only so long as he remained virtuous. When a king grew cruel or negligent, heaven withdrew its mandate and bestowed it upon a worthier house. The Shang had lost this mandate through tyranny. The Zhou had received it through righteousness. This was not merely propaganda. It became the foundational political philosophy of Chinese civilization, justifying every dynastic transition that followed. King Wu, the Zhou conqueror, died within years of his victory. His young son inherited a realm stretching from the Wei River Valley eastward across the Central Plains. The Duke of Zhou, acting as regent, suppressed rebellions by Shang loyalists and discontented Zhou princes alike. Then he undertook something unprecedented in scale, the systematic enfeoffment of relatives and allies across the conquered territories. Brothers, sons, nephews, and trusted commanders received walled towns and surrounding lands, charged with governing local populations, providing military forces, and sending tribute to the Zhou capital at Hao, near modern Xi'an. This was the Fengjian system, often translated as feudalism, though it differed from its European counterpart. Each lord owed allegiance to the Zhou king, the son of heaven, who stood at the apex of a hierarchy bound by kinship, ritual obligation, and shared culture. The system created perhaps 70 or more vassal states, each reproducing Zhou institutions in miniature. Lords built ancestral temples, maintained ritual bronze vessels, and performed ceremonies that mirrored the royal court. Ritual music became the binding force of this order. Bronze bells, stone chimes, drums, and flutes accompanied every significant ceremony, sacrifices to ancestors, diplomatic banquets, military assemblies, seasonal festivals. The Zhou believed that proper music harmonized human society with cosmic order. Specific melodies corresponded to specific occasions. The number of dancers, the arrangement of instruments, the very tones permitted, all reflected rank and propriety. A vassal who used music reserved for the king committed not merely an offense against etiquette, but a violation of cosmic harmony. The early Zhou also produced literature that became canonical. The Book of Documents preserved speeches and proclamations attributed to the founders. The Book of Songs collected over 300 poems, folk songs, court hymns, and ritual odes, offering glimpses of aristocratic banquets, peasant harvests, lovesick women, and soldiers far from home. These texts, later edited and transmitted by Confucian scholars, became the bedrock of Chinese literary education for millennia. For roughly 2 centuries, the system held. The Zhou kings performed great sacrifices, mediated disputes among vassals, and led military campaigns against non-Zhou peoples on the periphery. Bronze inscriptions from this era record land grants, legal judgments, and commemorations of royal favor. A bureaucratic culture growing more sophisticated with each generation. Yet the Fengjian system carried the seeds of its own dissolution. As generations passed, the kinship bonds connecting vassal lords to the royal house grew thin. Local lords developed independent power bases, intermarried with neighboring states, and accumulated wealth from agriculture and trade. The Zhou king's authority depended on prestige rather than standing armies, on ritual legitimacy rather than direct administrative control over distant territories. By the 9th century before the Common Era, signs of strain appeared. Kings faced resistance from vassals, suffered military defeats against nomadic peoples pressing from the north and west, and struggled to maintain the ritual primacy that justified their position. The court at Hao grew increasingly isolated, its effective power shrinking even as its ceremonial claims remained vast. Then, in 771, before the Common Era, catastrophe struck. A coalition of rebellious nobles and nomadic Quanrong warriors sacked the Zhou capital. King Yu perished in the attack. Later tradition blamed his obsession with a concubine and his abuse of the beacon fire warning system. The western heartland was lost. The surviving Zhou court fled eastward to Luoyang, beginning a diminished existence under the protection of powerful vassals. The Western Zhou had ended. The system of ritual order and feudal loyalty it had built would persist in theory, but power now belonged to those strong enough to seize it. The court at Luoyang still performed the ancient rites. Bronze bells still rang at the proper seasons, and the Zhou king still bore the title Son of Heaven. But everyone understood the truth. Real authority had fractured into the hands of regional lords, whose domains now functioned as independent states. The spring and autumn period had begun, and with it came 3 centuries of political turbulence that would accidentally produce the most extraordinary intellectual flowering in Chinese history. The old feudal order crumbled slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Powerful states like Qi, Jin, Chu, and Qin expanded at the expense of weaker neighbors. Smaller fiefdoms were absorbed or annihilated. The hereditary aristocracy that had governed under Zhou ritual principles found itself displaced by ambitious ministers, military commanders, and men of talent who rose through cunning rather than birth. The social hierarchy that once seemed eternal revealed itself as fragile. And in that fragility, in that terrifying openness, thinkers began asking questions that no one had dared ask before. What makes a ruler legitimate? What is the proper relationship between a lord and his subjects? How should a person live in a world where ancient certainties have dissolved? These were not abstract puzzles. They were urgent, practical questions born from watching kingdoms collapse and families scatter. Wandering scholars began traveling between courts, offering their wisdom to any lord willing to listen, seeking patronage and influence in exchange for answers to the crisis of their age. Kong-Q, known to later centuries as Confucius, was born around 551, before the Common Era in the state of Lu. He came from minor nobility fallen into poverty, and he devoted his life to recovering what he believed was the moral wisdom of the early Zhou founders. For Confucius, the crisis was not political, but ethical. Rulers had forgotten benevolence. Sons had forgotten filial devotion. The rituals that once bound society together had become empty performances. His teaching centered on Ren, humaneness, the cultivation of moral character through disciplined self-reflection, proper relationships, and sincere practice of ritual. He gathered disciples, traveled between states seeking a ruler who would implement his vision, and was largely rejected during his lifetime. Yet his students preserved his sayings, and within generations his thought became the foundation of Chinese governance and education. A different answer emerged from the figure tradition calls Laozi, the Old Master, whose historical existence remains debated, but whose attributed text, the Tao Te Ching, crystallized a philosophy of radical simplicity. Where Confucius sought to restore social order through moral effort, the Taoist vision suggested that striving itself was the problem. The Tao, the way, operated through effortless naturalness. Water overcomes stone not through force, but through yielding persistence. The sage ruler governs by doing less, not more. This was not passivity, but a profound critique of the ambition and artifice that drove the warring states toward destruction. These were only the most enduring voices among dozens. Mozi preached universal love and opposed aggressive warfare. Rhetoricians debated the nature of language and logic. Military theorists codified strategy. Each school responded to the same fracturing world, each offering a different path through chaos. The phenomenon later generations called the 100 Schools of Thought was not a planned movement but an emergent consequence of political collapse, meeting unprecedented social mobility. When the old answers failed, new ones rushed in to fill the void. The courts of competing states became laboratories for these ideas. A lord might employ Confucian advisors for education, legalist administrators for taxation, and military strategists for defense, all simultaneously. Philosophy was never merely theoretical in this world. It was statecraft, survival, and the desperate search for order in an age when the mandate of heaven seemed to have been withdrawn from everyone at once. By the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era, as the spring and autumn period shaded into the even more violent warring states era, these intellectual traditions had taken root so deeply that no future dynasty could ignore them. The questions asked during these turbulent centuries about justice, governance, human nature, and the cosmos would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. From political ruin had come an inheritance more durable than any bronze vessel or city wall. The philosophical inheritance was real, but philosophy alone could not stop an army. By the mid-5th century before the Common Era, the old feudal order had shattered completely, and 7 major states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Zhao, Wei, and Han, entered a period of relentless warfare that would consume 2.5 centuries and millions of lives. This was the Warring States era, and it transformed China into something entirely new. The scale of violence dwarfed anything the spring and autumn period had known. Armies that once numbered in the tens of thousands now swelled to hundreds of thousands. The aristocratic chariot warfare of earlier centuries gave way to massed infantry formations, cavalry units modeled on steppe nomad tactics, and siege warfare of terrifying sophistication. Crossbow bolts darkened the sky above battlefields, where conscript farmers fought and died far from their villages. Iron made this transformation possible. Where bronze had been expensive, reserved for ritual vessels and elite weapons, iron ore was abundant and could be smelted in quantity. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Chinese foundries had mastered cast iron production, a technology Europe would not achieve for another 1,500 years. Iron plowshares broke new ground, feeding larger populations. Iron swords and spearheads armed larger armies. The metal democratized both agriculture and destruction simultaneously. States that adapted survived. Those that clung to tradition perished. The Kingdom of Wei pioneered military reforms early, training elite infantry units and building irrigation systems that multiplied grain yields. Qi invested in scholarship and commerce, its Jixia Academy attracting thinkers from across the known world. Chu expanded southward into subtropical territories, absorbing non-Chinese peoples and their resources. But it was Qin, isolated in the western highlands, that would undergo the most radical transformation. In 356 before the Common Era, a minister named Shang Yang implemented reforms in Qin that dismantled the old aristocratic order entirely. Land was redistributed based on military merit. Peasants who produced surplus grain or killed enemy soldiers rose in rank. Nobles who failed to serve lost their privileges. The entire state became a machine organized for war and agriculture. Nothing else mattered. These were the principles of legalism made flesh. Clear laws, harsh punishments, absolute obedience to the state. Other states attempted similar reforms with varying success. Everywhere, the old bonds of kinship and ritual obligation dissolved under the pressure of survival. Diplomacy became an art of deception. Alliances shifted season by season. The strategy of horizontal and vertical coalitions, states banding together east to west or north to south, kept any single power from achieving dominance for generations. Military treatises proliferated. Sun Bin refined the strategic principles attributed to his ancestor Sun Tzu, emphasizing deception, terrain, and the conservation of force. Commanders studied logistics with mathematical precision. Defensive walls of rammed earth rose along contested borders, precursors to the Great Barrier that would one day span the northern frontier. Yet, amid the carnage, civilization advanced with extraordinary speed. Cities grew vast and wealthy. Merchants accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of lords. Bronze coinage circulated in multiple forms, knife-shaped in Qi, spade-shaped in Wei, round in Qin. Lacquer work achieved breathtaking refinement. Silk production expanded into an industry of enormous scale. The Dujiangyan irrigation system, built in Qin territory around 256 before the Common Era, tamed the Min River and turned the Chengdu Plain into one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. It still functions today. by the late 3rd century before the Common Era, Qin's relentless machinery had ground down its rivals one by one. Its population was disciplined, its granaries full, its armies battle-hardened across generations of frontier warfare. The other 6 states, weakened by mutual suspicion and internal decay, could not unite against the Western power. The Warring States period had served as a crucible, and from that crucible, a single state emerged with the strength, the administrative tools, and the ruthless will to impose unity on the entire Chinese world. The age of competing kingdoms was ending. The age of empire was about to begin. In 221 before the Common Era, the King of Qin accomplished what no ruler in Chinese history had achieved before. He conquered the last of the 6 rival states, absorbed their territories, and declared himself Shi Huang, the first emperor. The title itself was an invention, combining ancient words for the legendary sage kings with the concept of supreme divine authority. No mere king's title would suffice for the man who had ended 5 centuries of fragmentation and brought the entire Chinese world under a single throne. The unification was swift and total. Within a decade, armies swept east and south, swallowing Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi in succession. But military conquest was only the beginning. The first emperor and his chief minister Li Si understood that unity imposed by the sword would dissolve without unity imposed upon the mind. What followed was the most ambitious program of standardization the ancient world had ever seen. The empire's diverse scripts, evolved separately across centuries of regional isolation, were replaced by a single writing system. Weights and measures were unified, so that a bushel of grain in the far south meant the same quantity as in the northern frontier. Axle widths were standardized so that cartwheels fit the same ruts on every road. Currency took a single form, round bronze coins with square holes at their center. These were not mere administrative conveniences. They were instruments of psychological transformation, designed to erase the memory of separate kingdoms and replace it with the reality of one state. The empire was divided into 36 commanderies, each governed by appointed officials rather than hereditary lords. The feudal system that had defined Chinese politics since the Western Zhou was abolished in a single stroke. Local aristocracies were forcibly relocated to the capital at Xianyang, stripped of their regional power bases and kept under imperial surveillance. The message was unmistakable. There would be no dukes, no independent fiefdoms, no competing centers of authority. Roads radiated outward from Xianyang, connecting the empire's distant reaches. Defensive walls along the northern frontier were linked and extended into a continuous barrier against steppe nomads, a project requiring hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers. Canals were dug, palaces rose, and beneath a man-made mountain near the capital, construction began on a tomb of staggering ambition, an underground empire guarded by thousands of life-size terracotta warriors, each with individualized features arranged in battle formation to serve their emperor in death as living soldiers had served him in life. The cost was enormous. Conscription drained villages. Harsh legalist punishments fell upon any who resisted. Books of philosophy and history that celebrated the old feudal order were burned by imperial decree. Scholars who protested were silenced. The empire ran on fear and efficiency in equal measure, a machine calibrated for obedience. Yet the first emperor's obsessions consumed him. He toured his realm repeatedly, erecting stone inscriptions proclaiming his achievements. He sought elixirs of immortality, dispatching expeditions to mythical islands in the eastern sea. His paranoia deepened with age. He survived assassination attempts and trusted fewer advisors with each passing year. In 210 before the Common Era, during a tour of the eastern provinces, the first emperor died. He was 49 years old. His reign had lasted barely 11 years after unification, yet in that span he had reshaped the political architecture of an entire civilization. The centralized bureaucratic state, the uniform script, the concept of a single empire stretching from sea to steppe, these would outlast every dynasty that followed. The Qin dynasty itself would collapse within 4 years of his death, torn apart by rebellion and succession crisis. But the idea of China as one unified realm, governed from a single center by a single sovereign authority, would never again be fully abandoned. The first emperor had built not merely an empire, but a template, and every ruler who came after would measure himself against it. The template survived its maker. Within 4 years of the first emperor's death, peasant armies and aristocratic rebels tore the Qin state apart. From the chaos emerged 2 rivals, a former aristocrat from the old kingdom of Chu and a commoner from a minor district in the east. Their struggle consumed China for years until, in 202 before the Common Era, the commoner prevailed. Liu Bang, a man of no noble birth and little formal education, founded the Han Dynasty and took the throne as Emperor Gaozu. For the first time in Chinese history, a peasant son ruled all under heaven. The early Han rulers governed cautiously. They retained the Qin framework of centralized administration, the commanderies, the standardized laws, the bureaucratic apparatus, but softened its harshest edges. Taxes were reduced, punishments were lightened. Confucian scholars, persecuted under the Qin, returned to court, yet the first decades remained fragile. Semi-independent kingdoms still controlled vast territories within the empire, and nomadic Xiongnu horsemen raided the northern frontier with impunity. Gaozu himself suffered humiliating defeat at their hands and was forced to buy peace through tribute and marriage alliances. For 60 years, the Han consolidated quietly, accumulating grain reserves and population. Then came the ruler who would transform consolidation into dominance. Emperor Wu ascended the throne in 141, before the Common Era at the age of 15. He would reign for 54 years, longer than any Chinese emperor before him, and in that time he reshaped the empire into something unprecedented in scale and ambition. His first revolution was intellectual. In 136 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu formally established Confucianism as the state ideology, creating an imperial academy where scholars studied the classical texts and from which graduates entered government service. This was not merely philosophical preference, it was institutional architecture. The examination of candidates based on Confucian learning created a civil service bound by shared values and textual knowledge. Governance became inseparable from scholarship. The bureaucratic state that the Qin had built through force, the Han now sustained through education. His second revolution was military. Refusing the humiliation of tribute to the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu launched massive campaigns northward into the steppe, westward into Central Asia, and southward into what is now Vietnam. Han armies pushed the Xiongnu Confederation back beyond the Gobi Desert. Expeditionary forces reached Ferghana in modern Uzbekistan, securing access to the famed horses of the western regions. Garrison colonies stretched along corridors of sand and wind. It was through these military corridors that commerce flowed. The routes that later generations would call the Silk Road opened not as trade ventures, but as strategic passages. Zhang Xian, dispatched westward on a diplomatic mission in 138 before the Common Era, spent 13 years in captivity and wandering before returning with intelligence about kingdoms stretching toward Persia and Rome. His reports ignited imperial imagination. Caravans soon carried Chinese silk westward through oasis towns, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, while jade, horses, glass, and grape wine traveled east. The Han Empire connected to a continental web of exchange that would endure for 1,000 years. At its zenith under Emperor Wu, the Han governed perhaps 60 million people across territories stretching from Korea to Vietnam, from the Pacific coast to the Pamir Mountains. The capital at Chang'an grew into one of the largest cities on earth, its markets thronging with merchants from dozens of lands. Iron was nationalized. Salt monopolies filled state coffers. A census system tracked households with remarkable precision. Yet, expansion carried costs. Decades of warfare drained the treasury. Taxes rose. Conscription burdened farming families. In his final years, Emperor Wu issued a rare edict of self-criticism, acknowledging the suffering his ambitions had caused. The dynasty endured after him, but never again reached quite the same pitch of aggressive expansion. Subsequent emperors governed through the Confucian bureaucracy he had built, managing a vast empire through paperwork, ritual, and the slow rotation of officials through provincial posts. The Han had become not merely a dynasty, but a civilization's identity, so deeply that the Chinese people would come to call themselves the Han, a name that persists across 2 millennia. The dynasty that bore the Han name fractured once before its final end. In the year 9 of the Common Era, a regent named Wang Mang seized the throne, declaring a new dynasty he called Qin. His reforms, nationalizing land, abolishing slavery, manipulating currency, collapsed within 15 years under peasant revolts and aristocratic resistance. By the year 25, a distant Liu kinsman restored Han rule, but the capital shifted eastward from Chang'an to Luoyang. This restored dynasty, the Eastern Han, inherited the bureaucratic machinery and Confucian ideology of its predecessor, yet governed a subtly different world. Luoyang rose as a city of broad avenues and towering gate towers, its imperial academy enrolling tens of thousands of students in classical texts. The court functioned through an elaborate hierarchy of ministers, secretaries, and eunuch attendants who managed documents flowing from every corner of the empire. And it was within this world of paperwork that one of history's quietest revolutions occurred. Around the year 105, a court official named Cai Lun presented to the emperor a refined method of producing writing material from bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets. Paper had existed in crude forms before him, but Cai Lun's process yielded sheets smooth enough for brush and ink, light enough for transport, cheap enough for widespread use. The implications unfolded slowly across generations. Administrative records multiplied, literary culture spread beyond aristocratic libraries, and knowledge itself became more portable. Along the same trade routes that carried silk westward, something else traveled eastward. Buddhism arrived in China not as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual infiltration. Merchants and monks from Central Asia brought sutras and meditation practices into Han territory during the 1st and 2nd centuries. By the reign of Emperor Ming, tradition holds that envoys were dispatched to seek Buddhist scriptures. Monasteries appeared near Luoyang. Translation workshops rendered Sanskrit texts into Chinese, a labor requiring not merely linguistic skill, but philosophical negotiation between Indian metaphysics and Chinese cosmology. The new faith offered something Confucianism did not: a systematic account of suffering, impermanence, and liberation that spoke to individuals rather than to social roles. Yet the Eastern Han court grew increasingly unstable. Power concentrated in the hands of two competing forces: consort families, who dominated through empresses and child emperors, and palace eunuchs, who controlled access to the imperial person. Each faction purged the other in cycles of conspiracy and massacre. In 169, eunuchs orchestrated a devastating proscription against reform-minded scholars and officials, silencing an entire generation of Confucian intellectuals. The bureaucracy that had been the dynasty's greatest strength became paralyzed by factional terror. Beyond the capital, the countryside deteriorated. Landlords accumulated vast estates while peasant families lost their plots to debt. Floods and droughts struck with regularity. In 184, a Taoist healer named Zhang Jue mobilized hundreds of thousands of desperate farmers into the Yellow Turban Rebellion, promising a new cosmic age. The court suppressed the uprising only by granting regional commanders extraordinary military authority. Authority those commanders never relinquished. Provincial warlords built private armies. The empire fragmented into competing power bases, while the emperor remained a puppet in Luoyang, then a hostage dragged between rival generals. Cao Cao, the most capable of these warlords, consolidated control over the north, governing in the emperor's name while wielding all real power. When the last Han emperor abdicated in 220, the act merely formalized what years of civil war had already accomplished. The Eastern Han left behind more than political wreckage. Its scholars had compiled dictionaries, histories, and mathematical treatises. Its artisans perfected lacquer work and ceramic glazes. Its engineers improved the seismoscope and water-powered bellows. Paper and Buddhism, two inheritances that would reshape all of East Asia, entered Chinese civilization during these 2 centuries of brilliance and decay. The dynasty dissolved, but its cultural deposits settled deep into the soil of everything that followed. 3 kingdoms rose from the ashes. When Cao Pi, son of Cao Cao, accepted the abdication of the last Han emperor in 220, he proclaimed the Wei dynasty and ruled from Luoyang. Within months, Liu Bei declared himself emperor of Shu Han in the southwestern highlands of Sichuan, claiming legitimate descent from the Han imperial line. Sun Quan waited longer, consolidating his hold over the rich lands south of the Yangtze, before formally establishing the kingdom of Wu in 229, with his capital at Jianye, the city later known as Nanjing. The geography of division was not accidental. Wei controlled the Great Northern Plain, the heartland of Chinese agriculture, commanding the largest population and the strongest cavalry. Shu Han occupied the Sichuan Basin, shielded by mountain passes so formidable that a handful of defenders could hold back armies of thousands. Wu possessed the waterways, the rice paddies of the middle and lower Yangtze, and a naval tradition that neither northern kingdom could match. Each state's military strategy reflected its terrain. Wei pressed southward with massed infantry. Shu launched audacious campaigns through mountain corridors. Wu built fleets of war junks and fortified river crossings. The strategist Zhuge Liang, serving Shu Han as chancellor, embodied the era's fusion of intellect and warfare. His northern expeditions against Wei between 228 and 234 stretched Shu's limited resources to breaking point, yet demonstrated tactical brilliance that later generations would study for centuries. He died on campaign, and with him perished Shu Han's best hope of reunification under the Liu banner. Wei itself underwent internal transformation. The Sima family, serving as generals and regents, gradually hollowed out Cao authority in a pattern eerily reminiscent of how Cao Cao himself had eclipsed the Han. Sima Yi outmaneuvered rivals at court. His son, Sima Zhao, wielded power openly. His grandson Sima Yan finally deposed the last Wei emperor in 265, establishing the Qin Dynasty. Within 15 years, Jin armies swept south, conquering Wu in 280 and ending 6 decades of tripartite division. The Three Kingdoms period lasted barely 60 years as political reality. Yet it imprinted itself upon Chinese consciousness with extraordinary permanence. The era produced innovations born of necessity. Crossbow mechanisms grew more sophisticated. Siege warfare advanced. Agricultural colonies called Tuntian settled soldiers on frontier lands, feeding armies while populating contested territory. Iron production continued despite fragmentation, and each kingdom maintained bureaucratic systems inherited from Han administration. But it was memory, not machinery, that gave this era its lasting power. The historical record compiled by Qin Shi in his Records of the Three Kingdoms preserved the events with scholarly precision. Centuries later, the 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms transformed these records into epic literature, elevating Cao Cao into the archetype of the brilliant villain, Liu Bei into the virtuous ruler, and Zhuge Liang into the supreme strategist whose wisdom bordered on the supernatural. The Brotherhood Oath, the borrowed arrows, the empty fort. These episodes entered folk culture so deeply that they shaped how Chinese civilization understood loyalty, cunning, and the nature of power itself. The period's cultural production extended beyond warfare. Cao Cao and his sons, Cao Pi and Cao Zhu, rank among the finest poets of their age, their verses marked by a directness and emotional intensity that broke from earlier courtly conventions. The 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, gathering in the decades after Wei's fall, cultivated philosophical conversation, wine, music, and deliberate eccentricity as responses to political danger. Their retreat from public service into aesthetic contemplation established a counter-tradition that would persist throughout Chinese intellectual history. When Jin reunification came in 280, it arrived not as triumphant restoration, but as exhausted consolidation. The population of China had plummeted. Millions had perished in warfare, famine, and displacement. The great families who survived accumulated vast estates and bound peasants to their land in arrangements that weakened central authority, even as unity was nominally restored. The Qin dynasty inherited a fractured society, held together by administrative habit more than genuine cohesion. Within a generation, that fragility would shatter again into something far worse than 3 kingdoms. A centuries-long division between North and South, that foreign invasion would deepen beyond anything the Han world had known. The fragility shattered in 316 when Xiongnu cavalry swept into the Jin capital at Luoyang and carried the emperor away in chains. 2 years later, Chang'an fell as well. The entire north, the ancient heartland of Chinese civilization, the Yellow River Plain, where millet had first been cultivated 5,000 years before, passed into the hands of non-Chinese rulers. What followed was not a single conquest, but a cascade. Over the next century and a half, 16 kingdoms rose and collapsed across the northern landscape, ruled by Xiongnu, Jie, Di, Qiang and Xianbei peoples who fought one another as fiercely as they fought the remnants of Chinese authority. The Jin court fled south across the Yangtze in 317, establishing a diminished dynasty at Jiangkang, modern Nanjing. For the first time in Chinese history, the political and cultural center of gravity shifted decisively southward. Aristocratic refugee families brought their libraries, their ritual traditions, their calligraphy. The South, once considered frontier territory, became the guardian of classical civilization. Rice paddies expanded through the Yangtze Delta. Population grew. A refined court culture flourished in exile, producing some of the finest landscape poetry and painting theory the tradition had yet known. But the North was not simply lost to barbarism. The Xianbei rulers of the Northern Wei dynasty, consolidated by 386, faced a fundamental question: how to govern a vast Chinese population while maintaining their own identity. Emperor Xiaowen, reigning from 471 to 499, chose radical sinification. He moved his capital to Luoyang, mandated Chinese dress and language at court, and adopted Chinese surnames for his Xianbei nobility. The old city rose again from its ashes, rebuilt with Buddhist monasteries lining every avenue. It was Buddhism that provided the bridge. Arriving along Silk Road trade routes during the Han, the faith had remained marginal. Now, in an age of warfare and displacement, its teachings on suffering and impermanence resonated with devastating clarity. Both northern rulers and southern aristocrats embraced it, though in different forms. In the north, Buddhism became state religion, a tool of legitimacy for foreign dynasties seeking to transcend ethnic division. In the south, it merged with Taoist contemplative traditions, producing sophisticated philosophical schools. The cave temples stand as the most enduring testimony. At Yungang, near the northern Wei capital of Datong, workers began carving colossal Buddha figures into sandstone cliffs around 460. The earliest caves contained Buddhas with distinctly Central Asian features: broad shoulders, thin robes clinging to muscular frames. As decades passed, the style transformed. Later carvings show elongated Chinese faces, flowing layered robes, serene expressions drawn from indigenous aesthetic traditions. At Longmen, outside Luoyang, carving continued after the capital's relocation, producing tens of thousands of figures across limestone walls. At Dunhuang in the far northwest, painted caves accumulated layer upon layer of devotional art spanning centuries, their murals preserving visions of paradise rendered in mineral pigments that still glow today. These were not merely artistic projects. They represented enormous mobilizations of labor, wealth, and faith. Emperors sponsored cave complexes to demonstrate piety and power simultaneously. Monks organized communities of artisans. Donors inscribed their names and prayers into stone, seeking merit for themselves and their ancestors. The caves functioned as libraries of doctrine, meditation halls, and political statements carved into the living earth. By the 6th century, both North and South had exhausted themselves through internal conflict. The Northern Wei split in 534. Southern dynasties succeeded one another in coups and brief reigns. Yet, beneath the political chaos, a cultural synthesis was quietly completing itself. Northern and Southern traditions of governance, art, religion, and literature had cross-pollinated through refugees, monks, merchants, and diplomats moving between the divided halves. Chinese civilization had absorbed its invaders and been transformed by them in return. The Buddhism that entered as a foreign faith had become inseparable from Chinese culture. The aristocratic families who fled south had developed the Yangtze region into an economic powerhouse. When reunification finally came, it would draw upon both halves, northern military vigor fused with southern wealth, to forge something unprecedented. That fusion arrived in 581, when a northern general named Yang Jian seized the throne from the last child emperor of the northern Zhou. He declared a new dynasty, the Sui, and within 8 years accomplished what 3 centuries of division had made unthinkable. His armies crossed the Yangtze in 589, overwhelming the last southern dynasty, the Qin, and reuniting China under a single imperial house for the first time since the fall of the Western Jin. Yang Jian, known posthumously as Emperor Wen, governed with the discipline of a man who understood how fragile unity could be. He simplified the legal code, reduced taxes, established granaries across the northern plains to buffer against famine, and reformed the civil service to weaken aristocratic monopolies on power. He drew upon Confucian governance, Buddhist piety, and legalist efficiency in equal measure. The population registers swelled as hidden households were brought back under state control. Within a decade, the imperial granaries held enough surplus to feed the realm for 50 years. The empire breathed, but the true ambition of the Sui revealed itself under his son. Emperor Yang, who ascended in 604 under circumstances shadowed by suspicion of patricide, possessed a vision of imperial grandeur that dwarfed his father's careful pragmatism. He relocated the capital to Luoyang, rebuilding it on a colossal scale, with walls stretching nearly 28 kilometers in circumference. Palaces rose surrounded by artificial lakes and gardens stocked with rare animals. The eastern capital became a statement of cosmic authority. Then came the canal. The Grand Canal was not built from nothing. Earlier dynasties had dug regional waterways, but Emperor Yang connected, deepened, and extended them into a single integrated system, stretching from Hangzhou in the south to the vicinity of modern Beijing in the north. Millions of conscripted laborers dug through the alluvial plains, linking the Yangtze, the Huai, and the Yellow River into one navigable corridor more than 1,700 kilometers long. The human cost was staggering. Contemporary sources speak of every household in certain regions contributing labor, of bodies buried in the embankments, of overseers flogging workers through summer heat and winter frost. Yet the canal transformed China permanently. Southern rice could now flow northward to feed armies and capitals. Merchants moved goods across latitudes that once required weeks of overland travel. The economic integration of North and South, begun by refugees and monks during the centuries of division, now had a physical spine of water binding the empire together. Emperor Yang's ambitions extended beyond infrastructure. He launched 3 massive military campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo between 612 and 614. Each expedition mobilized over 1 million soldiers and support workers. Each ended in catastrophic failure. The first campaign saw an army of over 300,000 cross the Yalu River, only to be annihilated in retreat, with barely 3,000 survivors reaching safety. The subsequent campaigns fared little better. The northeastern frontier consumed men and treasure without yielding conquest. The empire buckled. Conscription and forced labor had emptied villages. Floods broke neglected dikes. Banditry spread across provinces drained of their young men. By 613, rebellions erupted simultaneously across the realm. Emperor Yang retreated southward to Jiangdu, surrounded by an ever-shrinking circle of loyalists. In 618, his own guard strangled him with a silk cord. The Sui lasted only 37 years and 2 effective emperors. Its brevity mirrors the Qin, another dynasty that unified through force, built monumental infrastructure, and collapsed under the weight of its own demands upon the people. Yet, like the Qin, the Sui created the framework that its successor would inherit and perfect. The Grand Canal endured for 14 centuries. The reunified bureaucratic state endured. The examination system, refined under Sui administration, endured. The equal field land distribution system endured. Even the rebuilt Luoyang endured as a secondary capital. Within months of Emperor Yang's death, a former Sui general named Li Yuan entered the capital and proclaimed a new dynasty. He called it the Tang. Everything the Sui had built, the canals, the granaries, the administrative machinery, the reunified territory, passed intact into new hands. The dynasty that overreached had nonetheless laid every foundation stone for what would become the most celebrated golden age in Chinese history. Li Yuan reigned only 9 years before his second son seized the throne in a palace coup that left 2 brothers dead at the Zhuanmen Gate. The man who emerged from that bloodshed in 626 took the reign name Taizong, and he would spend the next 23 years building what historians across centuries would call the most brilliantly governed state of its age. The violence of his accession haunted him. It also drove him. Taizong surrounded himself with advisors who dared to criticize, most famously Wei Zheng, whose blunt counsel the emperor endured with calculated grace. The resulting administration balanced Confucian idealism with pragmatic flexibility, drawing talent through an expanded examination system that opened government service beyond aristocratic bloodlines. Chang'an became the axis of this world. By the early 7th century, the Tang capital stretched across 84 square kilometers, making it the largest planned city on Earth. A grid of 11 north-south avenues and 14 east-west streets divided the metropolis into 108 walled wards, each locked at nightfall by drum signal. The imperial palace complex anchored the northern edge, its daeming palace rising on elevated ground with audience halls whose pillars stood lacquered in vermilion. Nearly 2 million people filled this grid, merchants from Persia, monks from India, diplomats from Byzantium, musicians from Samarkand, and scholars from Korea and Japan. Zoroastrian fire temples stood within walking distance of Buddhist monasteries and Nestorian Christian churches. The Western market alone contained hundreds of shops trading in spices, gems, horses, medicines, and slaves. Taizong's military campaign secured the borders that made this cosmopolitanism possible. Turkish Khanades submitted. Central Asian oasis kingdoms accepted Tang suzerainty. The Silk Road flourished under imperial protection, its caravans moving freely between Dunhuang and distant Kashgar. When Taizong died in 649, his son inherited an empire stretching from the Korean peninsula to the Pamirs. Then came the extraordinary reign of Wu Zetian. Rising from concubine to empress consort to regent, she finally declared herself emperor in 690 Dai, the only woman in Chinese history to hold that title outright. She ruled for 15 years under her own Zhou dynasty, promoting Buddhism as ideological support, expanding the examination system further, and ruthlessly eliminating rivals through a secret police apparatus. Her reign proved that Tang institutions could function under radically unconventional leadership. The dynasty's cultural zenith arrived under Emperor Xuanzong, who ascended in 712 and presided over 4 decades of extraordinary artistic production. The poets Li Bai and Du Fu composed during his reign, their verses capturing everything from moonlit solitude to the grandeur of imperial banquets. Li Bai wrote with spontaneous brilliance, his lines soaked in wine and Taoist transcendence. Du Fu crafted meticulous observations of human suffering and political decay. Together, they define Chinese poetry's highest achievement. Wang Wei painted landscapes in monochrome ink that dissolved the boundary between poetry and visual art. Wu Daozi covered temple walls with figures so vivid that legend claimed they breathed. Music flourished in the Pear Garden Academy Xuanzong personally established. Central Asian instruments, the Fipa lute, the Konghu harp, blended with Chinese traditions to create new forms. Dancers performed routines choreographed to rhythms from Kusha and Bukhara. Ceramics achieved new sophistication in Sansai 3-color glazes, their amber, green, and cream tones adorning tomb figurines of horses, camels, and foreign merchants. The examination system matured into a genuine meritocratic pathway. Candidates studied the Confucian classics, composed poetry under timed conditions, and submitted policy essays. Success brought prestige that transcended birth. Provincial families sent sons to Chang'an's academies, creating a shared literary culture that bound the empire's educated class together across vast distances. By 740, the Tang governed roughly 50 million people across a territory rivaling the Han at its greatest extent. Trade revenues swelled the treasury. Tributary missions arrived annually from dozens of kingdoms. Chang'an glittered as the undisputed center of East Asian civilization, its influence radiating outward to shape the urban planning of Nara, the script systems of Tibet, and the governmental structures of unified Silla. The Golden Age seemed inexhaustible, yet within the imperial court, a frontier general named An Lushan was accumulating military power that would soon shatter this luminous world. In the winter of 755, An Lushan marched south from his frontier command at Fanyang with 150,000 battle-hardened troops. The roads to the heartland lay open. Within weeks, his cavalry seized Luoyang, the eastern capital, and An Lushan declared himself emperor of a new Han Dynasty. The Tang court, stunned by the speed of the advance, scrambled to organize resistance. Emperor Xuanzong fled Chang'an the following summer along mountain roads towards Sichuan, his retinue dwindling as soldiers mutinied and demanded the execution of his chief minister. The emperor, who had presided over 4 decades of splendor, abandoned his capital in disgrace. Chang'an fell to rebel forces in 756. The great cosmopolitan metropolis suffered looting, its markets emptied, its foreign merchants scattered. The poet Du Fu, trapped behind rebel lines, witnessed the desolation firsthand and transformed it into verses that would define Chinese literary consciousness for a millennium. His counterpart Li Bai, caught on the wrong side of a princely rebellion within the imperial family, narrowly escaped execution. Poetry became the medium through which an entire civilization processed catastrophe. The rebellion lasted 8 years. Imperial forces, aided by Uyghur cavalry allies from the steppe, gradually recaptured territory, and Lushan himself was murdered by his own son in 757, and the rebel movement fragmented into competing factions. Chang'an was retaken that same year, though at terrible cost. The Uyghur allies demanded payment in silk and exacted humiliating terms. By 763, the last rebel stronghold surrendered, but the empire that emerged bore little resemblance to its former self. The census told the story most starkly. Before the rebellion, Tang registers recorded approximately 53 million people. Afterward, the count plummeted to fewer than 17 million. Not all had perished. Millions fled south, beyond the reach of census takers, accelerating a demographic shift that would permanently rebalance Chinese civilization toward the Yangtze Valley. But the death toll remained staggering. One of the deadliest conflicts in human history before the modern era. Power devolved irreversibly. Provincial military governors who had helped suppress the rebellion retained their armies and territories, becoming hereditary warlords in all but name. The northeast, where An Lushan had built his power base, remained effectively autonomous for the remainder of the dynasty. The central government controlled revenues from an ever-shrinking portion of the empire. Tax reform under the two-tax system of 780 rationalized collection, but could not restore imperial authority over defiant provinces. Yet, cultural vitality persisted with remarkable tenacity. The late Tang produced some of the finest poetry in the language. Li Shangyin crafted densely elusive verses of longing and political disappointment. Bai Juyi composed accessible narratives that spread across East Asia, beloved in the courts of Japan. Chan Buddhism flourished in southern monasteries, developing the paradoxical teaching methods that would later transform Japanese culture as Zen. Landscape painting matured into a philosophical practice, artists seeking to capture not mere appearance, but the underlying patterns of the natural world. The dynasty's final century unfolded as slow dissolution. Eunuch factions controlled emperor selection, murdering rulers who resisted their influence. The Huangqiao Rebellion of 875 devastated the south and sacked Chang'an in 880, destroying what remained of the city's grandeur. Foreign communities that had defined its cosmopolitan character were massacred at Guangzhou. The imperial family became puppets of regional strongmen. In 907, the last Tang emperor abdicated, and China fractured into the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, a half-century of division before reunification under the Song. The Tang collapse reshaped East Asian civilization permanently. The aristocratic order that had governed China since the Han finally disintegrated, replaced by examination-selected bureaucrats in subsequent dynasties. Southern China emerged as the economic heartland. The cultural achievements of the era, its poetry, ceramics, painting, and Buddhist philosophy, became the classical inheritance against which all later dynasties measured themselves. The Golden Age had ended, but its light continued to illuminate everything that followed. The half-century of fragmentation ended when a military commander named Zhao Kuang-yin accepted the yellow robe from his own troops at Chenqiao in 960, founding the Song Dynasty with a deliberate paradox at its core. Unlike every reunifier before him, Zhao dismantled the very military culture that had brought him to power. He invited his generals to a banquet and persuaded them to retire with generous pensions, replacing warrior aristocrats with scholar officials, selected through the most rigorous examination system China had ever known. The dynasty chose intellect over force, commerce over conquest, innovation over expansion. Kaifeng, the Song capital, became the largest city on earth by the late 10th century, home to over 1 million inhabitants within its walls and suburbs. Unlike the rigid grid of Chang'an, with its gated wards locked at nightfall, Kaifeng pulsed with unrestricted commercial energy. Markets operated without curfew. Restaurants served food through the night. Entertainment quarters offered theater, puppet shows, storytelling, and cricket fights. Along the Bian Canal, barges delivered rice from the south, timber from the west, and salt from coastal evaporation ponds. The scroll painting known as Along the River during Qingming Festival captures this world in extraordinary detail. Shops with hanging signboards, camels carrying goods, sedan chairs navigating crowded bridges, tea houses overlooking the water. This commercial vitality rested on a monetary revolution. The Song government minted more copper coins annually than any previous dynasty, yet demand still outstripped supply. In Sichuan province, merchants began using promissory notes backed by iron coin deposits, and by 1024, the state itself issued official paper currency called jiaozi, the first government-backed paper money in human history. Bills of exchange, credit instruments, and merchant partnerships created a financial architecture that would not appear in Europe for centuries. Printing transformed knowledge itself. Bai Sheng invented movable ceramic type around 1040, allowing texts to be composed letter by letter rather than carved block by block. Though carved woodblock printing remained dominant for Chinese characters, the principle revolutionized information dissemination. The government printed enormous encyclopedias, medical texts, and agricultural manuals. Private publishers produced poetry collections, examination guides, and popular fiction. Literacy spread beyond the elite into merchant families and prosperous farming households. Gunpowder, known since the Tang era as an alchemical curiosity, became a weapon of war under Song military engineers. By the early 11th century, armies deployed fire arrows, explosive bombs launched by catapult, and early rocket-propelled devices. The formula appeared in the military compendium Wujing Zongyao of 1044, specifying precise ratios of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. The magnetic compass, refined from earlier geomantic instruments, guided Song merchant vessels across open ocean to Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. Quanzhou and Guangzhou became international ports where Arab, Persian, Indian, and Malay traders maintained permanent communities. Agricultural advances underwrote everything. Early ripening rice varieties imported from Champa allowed double cropping in the Yangtze Delta. Population surged past 100 million. Iron production reached levels unmatched until 18th century Britain, with blast furnaces in Hebei producing over 100,000 tons annually. Coal replaced charcoal as fuel in northern industries. Water-powered spinning machines processed hemp and silk. Yet the dynasty's deliberate military weakness left its northern frontier perpetually vulnerable. The Khitan Liao dynasty and later the Jurchen Jin dynasty pressed from Manchuria. The Song paid enormous annual tributes of silver and silk to maintain peace, a pragmatic calculation that preserved prosperity but eroded territorial integrity. When Jurchen cavalry finally breached Kaifeng's walls in 1127, capturing the emperor and his father, the northern Song ended in catastrophe. The court fled south, establishing a new capital at Hangzhou, carrying with it the commercial genius and technological brilliance that had made the northern Song the most economically advanced society of its age. The refugees who streamed south across the Yangtze in 1127 carried more than grief. They carried an entire civilization's accumulated knowledge, its printing blocks and astronomical instruments, its banking practices and navigational charts. Within a generation, the southern Song transformed Hangzhou from a regional city into the most magnificent urban center on Earth, a metropolis that would astonish Marco Polo a century later, even in its conquered state. Hangzhou sprawled along the shores of West Lake, its population swelling past 1 million by the late 12th century. Canals threaded through every district, crossed by hundreds of stone bridges. The imperial palace occupied the southern hills, modest by northern standards, yet surrounded by gardens of extraordinary refinement. Beyond its walls, the city pulsed with commercial energy that surpassed even Kaifeng's legendary markets. Night markets operated until the third watch. Restaurants specialized in regional cuisines from every province. Tea houses numbered in the thousands, serving as informal exchanges where merchants negotiated contracts and scholars debated philosophy. The Southern Song Navy became the dynasty's defining military instrument. Denied the northern plains where cavalry dominated, the court invested massively in riverine and coastal fleets. Warships carrying trebuchets patrolled the Yangtze, forming a liquid wall against northern invasion. Paddle wheel vessels powered by treadmills could maneuver independently of wind, giving Song commanders tactical flexibility unknown elsewhere. Gunpowder weapons evolved rapidly under military pressure. Explosive bombs launched from catapults, fire lances that prefigured firearms, and rockets that screamed across battlefields all emerged from southern Song arsenals. Maritime trade flourished as never before. The magnetic compass, refined during the Northern Song, now guided merchant fleets across open ocean. Quanzhou and Guangzhou became international ports where Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian traders maintained permanent communities. Chinese junks, built with watertight compartments and balanced rudders, sailed as far as East Africa. Customs revenues from overseas trade constituted a significant portion of state income, reducing dependence on agricultural taxation. Yet, the dynasty lived under perpetual shadow. General Yue Fei's campaigns to recover the north in the 1130s had shown military promise before the court recalled and executed him, preferring negotiated peace with the Yurchin Jin. The Treaty of Shaoxing in 1141 formalized partition, with the Song accepting tributary status. This pragmatic humiliation purchased decades of prosperity, but left the fundamental strategic problem unresolved. When the Mongol Empire destroyed the Yurchin Jin dynasty in 1234, the Song briefly celebrated the fall of old enemies before recognizing the far greater danger now pressing against their borders. Mongke Khan launched direct assaults on Sichuan in the 1250s, dying during the siege of Diaoyu Fortress in 1259. This death granted the Song a reprieve of nearly 2 decades. Kublai Khan resumed the campaign with methodical patience. Rather than frontal assault across the Yangtze, he encircled the Song strategically, conquering Yunnan and pressing from multiple directions. The siege of Xiangyang, a fortress city controlling access to the Middle Yangtze, lasted from 1268 to 1273. Its fall opened the river highway to the Song heartland. The final years unfolded with terrible swiftness. Mongol forces swept down the Yangtze. Hangzhou surrendered without siege in 1276. The Empress Dowager delivering the child emperor to Kublai's generals. Loyalist remnants fled south by sea, carrying 2 young princes. The last Song emperor, a boy of 8, drowned in 1279 when his fleet was destroyed at the naval battle of Yamen off the Guangdong coast. A loyal minister leaped into the sea carrying the child on his back rather than permit capture. 3 centuries of Song civilization, the most technologically innovative society the medieval world produced, ended in salt water and silence. Yet its commercial systems, its printing culture, its ceramic arts, and its philosophical traditions survived conquest intact, absorbed into the new order that Kublai Khan was already constructing from his capital at Dadu. Dadu rises where no Chinese capital has stood before. Kublai Khan builds his imperial city on the open plain north of the old Qin Dynasty ruins, laying it out in a perfect grid that stretches nearly 30 kilometers in circumference. The walls are rammed earth-faced with brick, the gates monumental, the boulevards wide enough for 9 horsemen riding abreast. At its center stands the palace compound, its halls roofed in glazed tiles of green and gold, its gardens stocked with transplanted trees carried on elephant back from distant provinces. This is not a steppe encampment. This is a statement that Mongol sovereignty intends permanence. In 1271, Kublai formally proclaims the Yuan dynasty, adopting a Chinese dynastic name drawn from the Book of Changes. The gesture is deliberate. He seeks legitimacy not merely through conquest, but through the language of Chinese political tradition. Yet the state he constructs is unlike any previous dynasty. Its ruling elite speaks Mongolian. Its administrative framework divides subjects into 4 hierarchical categories: Mongols at the apex, then Central Asian auxiliaries, then Northern Chinese, and finally the Southern Chinese, the most recently conquered and most numerous. The examination system that sustains Song governance is suspended for decades. Merit gives way to ethnic privilege, yet commerce flourishes as never before. The Mongol peace that stretches from the Pacific to the Black Sea eliminates barriers that fragmented trade for centuries. Caravans move freely along routes once interrupted by hostile borders. Paper currency, inherited from Song and Jin precedents, becomes the empire's universal medium of exchange. Kublai's government issues notes backed by silver reserves, enforcing acceptance under penalty of death. For a generation, the system functions brilliantly, knitting together an economy of staggering geographic reach. Into this world arrives a Venetian merchant's son. Marco Polo reaches Dadu around 1275 and remains in Kublai's domains for approximately 17 years. His later account, dictated in a Genoese prison, describes coal burning in household hearths, postal relay stations spanning thousands of kilometers, and a capital whose population dwarfs any European city. Scholars debate which details are first-hand observation and which are compiled from other travelers' reports, but the text transmits to medieval Europe its first sustained portrait of Chinese civilization's scale and sophistication. The Yuan court becomes a gathering point for diverse traditions. Tibetan Buddhism receives imperial patronage, with the Phagpa Lama designing a new script intended for all languages of the empire. Persian astronomers establish an observatory at Dadu. Muslim merchants dominate maritime trade at Quanzhou, where mosque minarets rise beside Buddhist pagodas. Chinese drama flourishes in this period precisely because literati excluded from government turn their talents to popular theater. The great Yuan plays, performed in northern dialect, create a theatrical tradition that endures for centuries. Yet the dynasty's foundations prove unstable. Kublai's later years bring costly failures. 2 disastrous naval invasions of Japan destroyed by typhoons. Expensive campaigns in Southeast Asia yielding little. After his death in 1294, succession disputes fragment Mongol unity. Emperors follow in rapid sequence, few ruling more than a handful of years. The paper currency system collapses through reckless overprinting, inflation destroying public confidence. The Yellow River shifts course catastrophically in the 1340s, flooding vast agricultural regions. Famine breeds rebellion. By the 1350s, uprisings engulf the South. Red Turban rebels invoke millenarian Buddhist prophecy, promising deliverance from foreign rule. The Yuan court, paralyzed by factional conflict, cannot mount coordinated suppression. Province after province slips from Mongol control. The empire that once spanned continents contracts to its northern heartland. In 1368, a former Buddhist novice and beggar named Zhu Yuanzhang captures Dadu itself, and the last Yuan emperor flees north into the steppe from which his ancestors came barely a century before. The Mongol century leaves behind a transformed landscape. New trade networks, new artistic forms, new religious configurations, and the memory that China's borders need not be defined by Chinese rulers alone. Zhu Yuanzhang takes the throne name Hongwu and establishes his capital at Nanjing, the southern city whose walls he expands into the longest urban fortification in the world. The former beggar who once begged rice from monastery kitchens now commands the reconstruction of an entire civilization. His reign spans 30 years of relentless institution building, driven by a peasant's suspicion of aristocratic privilege and a survivor's determination that no future dynasty will displace his own. The Hongwu emperor dismantles the office of prime minister entirely after discovering a conspiracy in 1380, concentrating all executive authority in the emperor's person. He divides the empire into provinces governed by officials selected through reinstated civil service examinations, restoring the Confucian bureaucratic tradition that the Yuan had partially abandoned. Land surveys register every field. Population registers record every household. Tax grain flows into state granaries through a system of labor obligations that binds peasants to their villages. The emperor publishes legal codes, village compacts, and moral instructions distributed to every county, attempting to reshape society from its foundations. His grandson inherits the throne, but reigns only 4 years before the Prince of Yan marches south from Beijing, in a civil war that ends with Nanjing's imperial palace in flames. The usurper takes the reign name Yongle and makes a decision that reshapes Chinese geography. He moves the capital north of Beijing, rebuilding the city on a cosmic axis oriented precisely south to north. The Forbidden City rises between 1406 and 1420. 9,900 rooms arranged in symmetrical courtyards behind walls of imperial red. Halls of carved lacquer and gilded thrones rest on white marble terraces. The complex embodies the Ming conviction that architectural perfection reflects celestial order. The Yongle emperor projects power outward with equal ambition. Between 1405 and 1433, 7 maritime expeditions under the Admiral Zheng sail fleets of enormous treasure ships across the Indian Ocean. These vessels, some measuring over 400 feet in length, carry silk, porcelain, and musk to Calicut, Hormuz, Aden, and the East African coast. They return with giraffes, gemstones, and ambassadors. The expeditions demonstrate Ming supremacy across maritime Asia without establishing permanent colonies, projecting prestige rather than extracting tribute through occupation. Yet after 1433, the voyages cease. Court factions favoring continental defense over maritime expenditure prevail. The shipyards fall silent. Records of navigation charts reportedly disappear into bureaucratic archives. China turns inward precisely as Portuguese caravels begin probing the African coast from the opposite direction. What endures is porcelain. The imperial kilns at Jingdezhen, perfect blue and white ware using cobalt imported from Persia, firing translucent bodies at temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees. Production reaches industrial scale, single orders for the palace number in the hundreds of thousands of pieces. This porcelain travels along revived trade routes to Southeast Asia, Japan, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe, where it becomes so synonymous with refinement that the English language adopts the word China itself as a term for fine ceramic ware. By 1500, the Ming state presides over perhaps 100 million people governed through the most elaborate bureaucratic apparatus on earth. The examination system produces a scholar official class steeped in classical learning. Printed books circulate widely. Agricultural manuals improve rice yields. Market towns proliferate along canal networks feeding the Grand Canal, which the Yongle Emperor restores to full operation, linking the rice surplus of the Yangtze Delta to the consumption demands of the northern capital. The dynasty's first century and a half represents restoration in its fullest sense, not merely the recovery of Chinese rule after Mongol dominion, but the conscious reconstruction of an idealized imperial order, grander and more systematic than any predecessor. The Forbidden City stands as its monument, Zheng He's voyages as its most dramatic gesture, and Jingdezhen porcelain as its most enduring export. The Ming have rebuilt the world their ancestors lost, perfected its forms, and sealed its borders against the uncertainties beyond. But the sealed borders cannot hold forever. By the mid-16th century, the Ming system that once seemed so perfectly constructed begins to fracture from within. Eunuch factions dominate the court, draining imperial coffers while provincial administrators struggle to collect taxes from gentry who have learned every loophole in the fiscal code. Silver flooding in from Spanish mines in the Americas through Manila, trade destabilizes prices, and when global silver flows contract in the 1630s, the rural economy collapses. Peasant rebellions erupt across the Northwest, where drought and famine have hollowed entire counties. Li Zicheng's rebel army enters Beijing in 1644. The last Ming emperor hangs himself on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City. But it is not the rebels who inherit the empire. A Ming general at Shanhai Pass opens the gate to Manchu cavalry waiting beyond the Great Wall. The Qing dynasty rides through that breach and never relinquishes what it seizes. The Manchus are not strangers to Chinese governance. Their leader Nurhaci had already organized his people into the Eight Banners system decades earlier, blending military discipline with administrative structure. His grandson takes the throne name Shunji and occupies the Forbidden City almost intact, adopting Ming court rituals, retaining the examination system, and demanding only that Chinese men adopt the Manchu hairstyle as a sign of submission. Resistance flares in the south for decades, but by 1683, when the Kangxi Emperor personally oversees the conquest of Taiwan from Ming loyalists, unification is complete. Kangxi reigns for 61 years, the longest rule in Chinese imperial history. He is a scholar who masters classical Chinese texts, studies Western mathematics with Jesuit missionaries, and commissions the most comprehensive dictionary the language has ever known. He campaigns personally against Galdan's Dzungar Mongols on the Central Asian steppe, securing the northern frontier through military force rather than wall building. He tours the South 6 times, inspecting flood control works along the Yellow River and reassuring Han Chinese elites that Manchu rule serves their interests. The empire expands to dimensions no previous dynasty achieved. Tibet accepts Qing suzerainty. Mongolia submits. Xinjiang falls under direct military administration. The Kangxi Emperor's grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, completes this expansion in the 1750s, campaigning deep into Central Asia and incorporating territories that double the geographic extent of the Ming. The Qing Empire at its zenith governs perhaps 1/3 of humanity. Prosperity accompanies expansion. New World crops introduced through Southeast Asian trade routes transform agriculture. Sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts allow cultivation of marginal hillside land previously considered worthless. Population surges from roughly 150 million in 1650 to over 300 million by 1800. Porcelain kilns at Jingdezhen reach new technical heights. Silk production intensifies in the Yangtze Delta. The Canton trade system channels tea, silk, and ceramics to European merchants hungry for Chinese goods, generating enormous silver inflows. The Qianlong Emperor commissions the complete library of the 4 treasuries, employing thousands of scholars to copy and catalog the entirety of Chinese literary heritage. Yet, this same project serves as an instrument of censorship, identifying and destroying texts deemed seditious to Manchu rule. The paradox defines Qing governance: preservation and control exercised simultaneously, cultural patronage inseparable from political surveillance. By the late 18th century, the signs of strain multiply beneath the gilded surface. Corruption penetrates every level of administration. The Haitian scandal reveals that a single imperial favorite has amassed wealth equivalent to years of state revenue. Population growth outpaces available farmland. The White Lotus Rebellion erupts in 1796, requiring nearly a decade to suppress and draining the treasury that Qianlong's wars had already diminished. The Long Autumn has begun, though the empire's sheer mass disguises its vulnerability. The Qing still commands the largest economy on earth, still governs more people than any other state, still projects confidence through ritual and architecture. But the world beyond its borders is transforming at speeds no dynasty has ever confronted. The transformation arrives not as philosophy or rebellion, but as cargo. British merchants, desperate to reverse a trade deficit created by insatiable European demand for tea and silk, flood southern Chinese ports with Indian-grown opium. By 1839, millions of Chinese subjects suffer addiction, and silver drains from the economy at catastrophic rates. When Commissioner Lin Zexu destroys 20,000 chests of opium at Canton, Britain responds with gunboats. The First Opium War exposes a terrible truth. The largest civilization on Earth cannot defend its own coastline against a few dozen steam-powered warships. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 cedes Hong Kong, opens 5 ports, and imposes indemnities that humiliate the dynasty. The wound festers. The Taiping Rebellion erupts in 1850, led by a failed examination candidate who believes himself the brother of Jesus Christ. 14 years of civil war kill more than 20 million people, devastating the Yangtze heartland. The Second Opium War brings Anglo-French troops to Beijing itself in 1860, where they burn the Summer Palace, its gardens and pavilions reduced to ash in an act of deliberate cultural destruction. The Qing survives only because regional commanders raise their own armies, and because foreign powers prefer a weakened dynasty to chaos. Reform comes too late and too cautiously. The self-strengthening movement builds arsenals and shipyards, yet leaves the examination system and court structure untouched. Japan, which modernized wholesale after 1868, defeats China decisively in 1895, seizing Taiwan and demonstrating that Asian nations can master Western military technology. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 attempts radical change, but collapses within weeks when Empress Dowager Cixi reasserts control. The Boxer Uprising of 1900 invites intervention by 8 foreign nations simultaneously. By 1905, the examination system that has selected officials for over 1,000 years is abolished. Provincial assemblies form. Revolutionary cells multiply in overseas Chinese communities and military academies. Sun Yat-sen articulates 3 principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. On the 10th of October, 1911, a military uprising at Wuchang triggers cascading provincial declarations of independence. The child emperor Puyi abdicates on the 12th of February 1912. 2,000 years of imperial rule, and not with a great battle, but with a quiet edict. Yet the civilization does not end. It transforms. The philosophical systems born in the Zhou era continue shaping governance and ethics across East Asia. Confucian emphasis on education, meritocratic selection, and social harmony persists in modern institutions from Seoul to Singapore. The technological gifts of the Song Dynasty, gunpowder, printing, and the compass long ago reshaped global civilization in ways their inventors never imagined. Chinese ceramics, silk production, and tea cultivation created the first truly global trade networks. Traditional medicine, martial arts, and calligraphy remain living practices rather than museum relics. The written script, evolved from those Shang oracle bones carved more than 3,000 years ago, still unites 1 billion speakers of mutually unintelligible dialects under a single literary tradition. The Grand Canal still carries barges. The Great Wall still traces its dragon spine across northern mountains. Terraced rice paddies still cascade down southern hillsides in patterns established millennia before the Common Era. What began as scattered millet farmers along the Yellow River became the longest continuous civilization in human history, not because it avoided catastrophe, but because it absorbed every catastrophe and emerged transformed yet recognizable. Each dynasty fell, yet the culture persisted. Each invasion reshaped the surface, while the deep currents of language, philosophy, and aesthetic sensibility flowed onward. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of Chinese civilization, that continuity is not rigidity, that endurance requires constant renewal, and that a people's story never truly ends. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete history of ancient China. If these stories have illuminated something new, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next exploration into the civilizations that built our world.